Less than a year into George Washington's presidency, there could be little doubt as to who was second in command. It was not Vice President John Adams, but Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton.
When he's appointed Secretary of Treasury in 1790, he immediately makes that position the single most important political position in the government outside of the presidency. He grabs that power, and he acts in a way that is daring and decisive and in some sense audacious. He is, in the eyes of his friends, one of the most creative statesmen in America. In the eyes of his enemies, he is one of the most dangerous.
Since his days as George Washington's aide-de-camp and throughout the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Hamilton had aggressively pushed for a strong and energetic federal government.
A good government ought to be constant and ought to contain an active principle, utility and necessity, an habitual sense of obligation, force, influence.
Now, serving as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton introduced the first stage of a radical plan to mend America's ailing economy: the assumption of state debts by the federal government.
What assumption is, there wasn't just one kind of American debt. There were 14. There was the debts of the national government, and then there were the debts of the 13 states. So you had 14 entities all scrambling to try and find different ways to pay it off. And Hamilton's insight was to consolidate all these debts into one pot and make the federal government responsible for it. It's a little bit like the 800 numbers on television. You know, if you have debt, you call this number, you'll get one easy monthly payment. Well, it's the same principle.
Hamilton's plan immediately came under fire. The loudest cries of disapproval emanated from the South. Unlike their northern counterparts, most of the southern states had already paid off their existing war debt. The man leading the charge against assumption was Hamilton's collaborator on the Federalist Papers, James Madison.
A public debt is a public curse in a representative government, greater than in any other.
Something has happened in the year 1790 that has made Madison think differently than he had been thinking at the Constitutional Convention.
Formerly a staunch Federalist, Madison now believed that Hamilton's Funding Act, which included the assumption of states' debts, would yield too much power to the federal government at the expense of states' rights. Madison's concerns were greatly influenced by his good friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson. During Jefferson's years in Paris, the two men corresponded regularly. In their letters, Jefferson confided to Madison that he was not a friend to a very energetic government, and that he did have some reservations about the powers granted by the new Constitution.
As soon as Jefferson returns, Madison places himself at Jefferson's disposal. He worships the ground Jefferson walks on and is fully prepared to subordinate his own position to Jefferson's. Madison begins to see that the Hamiltonian program will make the merchant class and northern capital the central feature in the new society. He begins, in effect, to see that Virginia is no longer going to be the dominant force in the new Union. That's unacceptable.
Madison possessed the votes in Congress to kill Hamilton's financial plan, and intended to do so. Thomas Jefferson shared Madison's concerns, but having served 5 years in Europe, he also realized that America would never be respected abroad until it resolved its debtor status. Jefferson remained above the fray over assumption until June of 1790. It was then that he encountered a haggard-looking Alexander Hamilton outside the office of President George Washington.
On this particular day, Hamilton, he looks rumpled, depressed, overcome, because his financial program is on the verge of being defeated, and he believes that if defeated, it will effectively mean the end of the American political experiment. Hamilton was accustomed to thinking that when his own ideas failed, that the entire experiment would fail.
Jefferson makes a note of this encounter later on.
He opened the subject of the assumption of state debts, that as to his own part, if he had not credit enough to carry such a measure as that, he could be of no use, and was determined to resign.
You always, with Jefferson's records of these things, have to take them with a grain of salt, because he never writes anything just for accident. It's always to tell his side of the story and to make himself generally come out looking good.
On considering the situation of things, I thought the first step toward some conciliation of views would be to bring Mr. Madison and Colonel Hamilton to a friendly discussion of the subject. I immediately wrote to each to come and dine with me the next day, mentioning that we should be alone. They came.
Jefferson volunteers to be the host for this dinner party and provide the wine. But I think that he is performing, at that moment in his career, a genuinely bipartisan act, and wanting to bring together the two competing political opponents, Madison and Hamilton, in an intimate environment where they might be able to see through the problem.
No official account exists of the dinner party, but somewhere between the main course and the coffee, the three statesmen struck a bargain.
Hamilton says to himself, well, what can I give them that they'll give me the assumption? Very practical. And he knows that Jefferson is very eager to have the federal government near Virginia, because he still believes that unless you can watch them, they'll become tyrannical.
At the time of the dinner party, some 16 sites had been proposed for the capital, with Virginia ranking near the bottom. But after some deft political horse trading by Hamilton and Madison, Virginia's status changed considerably.
Hamilton said, fine, you want to have the capital near you? That's fine with me. You give me Assumption, and I'll support you on creating a federal city right on your back porch.